The moment I saw the bank statement, my hands went numb. $75,000. My inheritance check from my father's estate, cashed 3 months ago, but I never received it. I stared at the document the estate attorney had just emailed me, reading the words over and over, as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something that didn't feel like the ground opening up beneath my feet. I'm Emma Castellano, 29 years old, a financial analyst in Seattle with a corner office view of the Sound and a six-figure salary I'd earned through 70-hour weeks and relentless competence. Numbers are my language. I understand patterns, anomalies, the stories that spreadsheets tell when you know how to read them. And this story was screaming something I desperately didn't want to hear. The check had been mailed to my childhood home in Portland, the house where my mother still lived, the house where my brother Marcus still lived at 32 years old, rent-free in the basement he'd transformed into what he called his bachelor sanctuary. I'd specifically asked Marcus twice over the past 3 months if any mail had come for me. Both times he'd looked me straight in the eye and said no, nothing, maybe it got lost, I should contact the attorney. Both times I'd believed him because he was my brother, because despite everything, despite the lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed and treated like the understudy in my own family, I still wanted to believe in the basic decency of blood. My father had died 6 months ago. A sudden heart attack that stole him from us on a Tuesday morning while he was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, coffee still steaming in his favorite mug. The grief had been crushing, made worse by the chaos of the funeral, the relatives, the endless casseroles, the strange suspended reality where nothing feels real and everything hurts. Dad had always been the gentler parent, the one who actually showed up to my college graduation when Mom stayed home because Marcus had a cold, the one who remembered my promotion to senior analyst and took me to dinner to celebrate while Mom forgot entirely. His will had been clear and specific, professionally drafted, leaving the bulk of his personal estate to me, including that $75,000 life insurance policy he'd maintained for years. The attorney, Mr. Harrison, had explained it all in his office 4 months ago, his voice kind but matter-of-fact, telling me the check would be mailed within 60 days to my address of record, which was still listed as the Portland house, since I'd only moved to Seattle 18 months earlier. And now that check was gone, cashed, vanished into someone's account, while I'd been patiently waiting and wondering and asking my brother if he'd seen it. But 3 weeks ago, Marcus bought a truck. A brand new Ford F-150, gunmetal gray, loaded with every upgrade, the kind of vehicle that costs $45,000 at minimum. He'd posted photos all over social media, grinning behind the wheel, caption reading, "Finally treating myself right." When I'd asked how he afforded it, he'd been vague, mentioned a bonus from work, changed the subject quickly. Marcus worked in sales at a furniture store, a job he'd held for 7 months, his longest employment streak in 3 years. I remember feeling that first whisper of suspicion, that small voice I'd spent my whole life training myself to ignore because good sisters don't think terrible things about their brothers, because family means trust, because I'd been taught since childhood that keeping the peace was more important than keeping score. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had been there my entire life, so familiar I'd almost stopped seeing it, like wallpaper you notice only when someone points out how faded it's become. Marcus was 3 years older. And from the moment I was born, it seemed the family had already decided who mattered more, who deserved the attention and excuses and endless second chances. I remember being 12 years old, bringing home straight A's and a certificate for winning the regional science fair, bursting through the door with pride so bright it hurt, only to find Mom on the phone bragging to her sister about how Marcus had made the JV basketball team even though he'd been benched most of the season. She'd glanced at my certificate, said, "That's wonderful, honey," in that distracted voice that meant she wasn't really listening, and gone back to her phone call while I stood there holding my accomplishments like wilted flowers nobody wanted. When it came time for college, I'd worked myself nearly sick to earn a full academic scholarship to University of Washington, a achievement my guidance counselor said was remarkable, something fewer than 5% of applicants received, and my parents took me to Applebee's to celebrate, just the three of us. A quiet dinner where Dad seemed proud, but Mom kept checking her phone. 2 years later, when Marcus barely graduated high school with a 2.3 GPA and got accepted to Portland State, the only school that would take him, Mom threw a huge party, invited 50 people, had a cake made with his name and frosting, and she and Dad paid his entire tuition, $32,000 a year, which he repaid by dropping out after 3 semesters to find himself. My career success, the promotions, the six-figure salary I'd earned by 27, none of it ever warranted more than a "that's nice, dear" from Mom. But every time Marcus got a new job, which happened every 6 to 9 months like clockwork, she'd call everyone she knew to announce his wonderful new opportunity, never mentioning that he'd been fired from the last one for showing up late repeatedly or arguing with his supervisor. Just 8 months ago, right before Dad died, I'd called to tell them I'd been promoted to senior analyst, a position I'd competed against 15 other candidates to win, and Mom had cut me off mid-sentence to ask if I'd seen Marcus's new girlfriend Brittany's Facebook photos, because weren't they just the most beautiful couple? "Why can't you be more easygoing like your brother?" she'd said to me 1,000 times throughout my childhood, as if my seriousness, my drive, my refusal to coast through life expecting everything to be handed to me was somehow a character flaw, something I should apologize for instead of cultivate. I'd moved to Seattle partly for the job opportunity, but mostly to escape the suffocating dynamic, the constant feeling of being invisible in my own family, the exhausting work of pretending it didn't hurt every single time. Dad had been different, kinder, the one who actually showed up, the one who remembered. And now I understood why he'd left that inheritance specifically to me, why the will had been so carefully worded, so legally precise, as if he'd known exactly what might happen and had tried to protect me, even from beyond the grave. But I'd spent 29 years learning to accept the mistreatment, to smooth things over, to be the one who understood and compromised and kept the peace no matter what it cost me. And that training ran deep, deeper than logic, deeper than self-respect, so deep I'd almost convinced myself that asking for basic fairness was somehow selfish. I called Mr. Harrison the next morning, my hands still shaking from a sleepless night spent staring at the bank statement, and his voice carried that careful professional sympathy that attorneys master when delivering bad news. "Yes, Ms. Castellano, I can confirm the check was mailed on February 15th to the Portland address, certified mail, and according to postal records it was delivered on February 19th, signed for by someone at that residence." February 19th. I'd called Marcus on February 23rd, just 4 days later, asking if any mail had come for me because I'd been expecting the inheritance check, and he'd looked right at me through the FaceTime screen and said no, nothing. Maybe it got lost in the system. These things happen with the postal service. Then I'd called again 3 weeks after that, mid-March, more insistent this time, because Mr. Harrison had assured me the check had been sent, and Marcus had sighed like I was being paranoid and said he'd check the mail every day. There was nothing with my name on it. I should file a claim for a lost check with the estate. Both times he'd lied with such casual ease, such perfect concern in his voice, and I'd believed him because the alternative was too terrible to consider, because suspecting your own brother of theft felt like a moral failing in itself, like I was the one doing something wrong by even allowing the thought into my mind. The bank records Mr. Harrison sent showed the check had been cashed on February 24th, just 5 days after delivery, deposited into an account at a branch in Southeast Portland, the branch 3 blocks from our childhood home. I sat at my desk in Seattle, the city gray and drizzling outside my window, and felt something shift inside me, that lifetime of trained compliance cracking like ice under pressure. I could confront Marcus directly, call him right now and demand answers and watch him lie again. Or I could investigate first, gather evidence, approach this the way I'd approach any financial discrepancy at work, with documentation and proof and irrefutable facts. Mom was on a cruise, I remembered. One of those 2-week Panama Canal trips she'd been planning for months, which meant the house would be empty except for Marcus, which meant I could visit without her interference, without her automatic defense of her golden child, without her inevitable plea for me to be understanding and forgiving, and all the things I'd always been while Marcus was never expected to be anything but himself. I booked a flight to Portland for the next morning, requested 2 personal days from work, and drove to my apartment in Capitol Hill with my mind racing through possibilities and explanations, most of which crumbled under the weight of that simple, terrible fact. The check was cashed 5 days after delivery, and Marcus bought a $45,000 truck 3 weeks ago. The childhood home looked exactly the same when I pulled up in my rental car Thursday afternoon. The craftsman-style house Dad had been so proud of with its deep front porch and the maple tree he'd planted the year I was born. And walking up those familiar steps felt like moving through water, every memory pressing against me, every dismissal and overlooked achievement and casual cruelty echoing in the creak of the boards beneath my feet. I still had my key, had never thought to give it back when I moved to Seattle because it was still home in some fundamental way despite everything, and the house smelled like it always had, like Mom's lavender candles and old wood and something indefinably familiar that made my chest ache. Marcus wasn't home, his truck, that beautiful new truck, absent from the driveway, and I moved through the rooms like a ghost in my own past, noticing what had changed and what hadn't, stopping outside my old bedroom door and finding it locked, which was strange because it had never locked before, and when I used the bathroom key that fit the same mechanism, I found the room transformed into Marcus's storage space. Boxes of his belongings stacked against the walls, his winter clothes hanging in my old closet, his camping equipment piled in the corner, like he'd colonized even this last space that had been mine, erasing me from the house as thoroughly as I'd been erased from family attention my entire life. And the anger that rose in me then was different from anything I'd felt before, cold and clear and righteous, untainted by guilt or the fear of being unreasonable. I stood in my old bedroom surrounded by Marcus's boxes and felt the memory surface like something physical, something I could touch. The security cameras. Dad had installed them 2 years ago after someone broke into the Hendersons' house 3 doors down, and he'd been so proud of the system, so meticulous about setting it up, showing me how the cameras covered every angle of the property, including the front porch and mailbox, explaining that everything uploaded automatically to cloud storage, that he'd prepaid the subscription for 5 years because it was cheaper that way, and he liked knowing the house was protected. He'd emailed me the login credentials too, I remembered now. Sent them to my personal email about 8 months ago with a note that said, just in case you ever need to check on the place when Mom and I are traveling. And I'd saved the email in a folder and forgotten about it until this exact moment when the possibility opened up before me like a door I'd been walking past without seeing. Marcus didn't know about those credentials, had no idea I could access the footage, because he'd been living in California when Dad set up the system, and he never paid attention to family details anyway, never bothered to learn how things worked or who had access to what, because he'd always assumed the world would simply arrange itself for his convenience. I left the house before he came home, drove to a coffee shop in Southeast Portland where nobody would recognize me, ordered something I didn't drink, and sat in the corner with my laptop and hands that wouldn't stop shaking as I pulled up that old email and clicked the link to the security portal. The interface was simple, designed for people who weren't particularly tech-savvy, with a calendar where you could select dates and a drop-down menu for which camera you wanted to view, and I selected the front porch camera and scrolled back to February 19th, the day the check was delivered according to the Postal Service, and pressed play with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footage was high definition, clear enough to see everything, timestamp in the corner showing 2:47 p.m., and I watched the mail truck pull up, watched the postal carrier walk to the mailbox with a stack of envelopes and a larger certified mail package, watched her place everything inside and close the little door and return to her truck. Then nothing for 17 minutes while I sat frozen, barely breathing, until the front door opened at 3:04 p.m. and Marcus walked out in sweatpants and a t-shirt, crossed the porch, opened the mailbox, and pulled out the stack of mail. I could see him flipping through the envelopes, casual and unhurried, and then he stopped, held up one envelope, and even from the camera angle I could see my name on it, could see him look at it for a long moment before glancing around like he was checking if anyone was watching, and then he kept it, tucked the entire stack under his arm with my envelope right there in the middle, and walked back inside the house. His face had been so clear on the camera, so perfectly visible, and the expression he wore wasn't guilt or conflict or even temptation. It was entitlement. Like he'd found something that belonged to him. Like my name on that envelope was just a minor administrative error the universe had made that he was correcting and watching it. I felt something inside me that had been bending my entire life finally snap. That lifetime of training to be understanding and forgiving and endlessly accommodating, breaking under the weight of this one crystal-clear moment of betrayal, this proof that he'd stolen from me without even the dignity of visible hesitation. And the person who stood up from that coffee shop table was different from the one who'd sat down, harder and clearer, and done with being the one who disappeared, so Marcus could take up all the room in our family, done with pretending that his cruelty was somehow my responsibility to absorb. I spent the next 3 hours in that coffee shop downloading everything, saving the video file to my laptop, to 2 different cloud storage services, to an external drive I bought at the electronics store next door, creating redundancy the way I'd been trained to do with critical financial data at work. And with each backup I felt more grounded, more certain, like I was building a foundation of irrefutable truth that no amount of Marcus's charm or Mom's denial could erode. Then I researched, falling into the methodical focus that made me good at my job, and what I found made the $75,000 feel almost small compared to the legal implications because mail theft was a federal offense, and forgery of a check over $1,000 was a felony in Oregon, and fraud was another charge entirely, each one stacking on top of the others like evidence in a case I was building against my own brother, and the word that kept appearing was federal, which meant this wasn't just some family dispute that could be smoothed over at Sunday dinner. This was the kind of crime that carried real prison time, 5 to 10 years according to one legal site. And I sat there with my cold coffee and felt my hands finally stop shaking as the victim mentality I'd worn my entire life cracked and fell away like a shell I'd outgrown. The bank was harder to deal with, required a police report number I didn't have yet. But the estate attorney, Mr. Harrison, helped, called in a favor with someone he knew in the fraud department. And 2 days later, I received a PDF of the cashed check, and seeing my signature forged there, Marcus's approximation of my handwriting obvious to anyone who looked closely, the letters too angular where mine curved, the whole thing slightly too large and confident where I always signed small and neat, felt like looking at physical evidence of his contempt. Like he hadn't even tried very hard because he never thought I'd fight back, never imagined I'd have the spine to challenge him, and the bank confirmed they had security footage from February 24th showing the person who cashed the check, stored for 6 months per their fraud prevention protocols, available with proper legal authorization. I called Dad's attorney again and asked a question I should have asked years ago. Did Dad ever mention why he left that money specifically to me, in a separate bequest, instead of just splitting everything 50-50? And Mr. Harrison was quiet for a moment before he said, "Your father came to see me about 4 months before he died, wanted to make sure that inheritance was ironclad, yours alone, no possibility of it being considered part of the general estate, and he said something I probably shouldn't repeat. But I think you need to hear it now," he said. "Emma's the one who'll make something of it. Marcus would just burn through it and expect her to bail him out like always." And I asked if he was sure about such an unequal distribution, and he said, "It's not unequal, it's fair. There's a difference." I sat in my Seattle apartment with tears running down my face and remembered the last time I'd seen Dad conscious. 2 days before the stroke that killed him, when he'd taken my hand and said, "Don't let them take advantage of your kindness, Emma. Being good doesn't mean being a doormat, you understand?" And I'd thought he was talking about work or relationships. But now I understood he'd been talking about exactly this. About Marcus. About Mom's enabling. About the family dynamic that had shaped my entire life. And he'd tried to give me not just money, but permission. The means and the blessing to finally value myself the way I'd never been valued. And I wasn't going to waste his last gift by handling this quietly, by protecting Marcus from the consequences of his own choices, by being understanding one more time while everyone expected nothing from him except that I'd forgive and forget and disappear back into my designated role as the family member whose needs didn't matter. Jessica Thornton's office was on the 8th floor of a downtown Portland building with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Willamette River, and she was exactly the kind of attorney I needed, mid-40s with sharp eyes and an efficient handshake, the kind of woman who'd probably face down her own share of men who underestimated her and learned to use it as a weapon. I'd found her through a referral from my estate attorney, Mr. Harrison, who'd said, "If you're serious about pursuing this, Jessica's who you want. She specializes in financial crimes and she doesn't mess around." And sitting across from her desk while she reviewed the security footage on her laptop, watched the forged check images, read through my timeline of events, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, maybe years. I felt like someone was actually on my side, without me having to apologize for taking up space. "This is prosecutable," she said finally, looking up from the documents with an expression that was part professional assessment and part genuine anger on my behalf. "Multiple felonies, actually. Federal mail theft, forgery, wire fraud since he deposited it electronically. We're talking about 5 to 10 years of potential prison time, and that's before we get into civil remedies. You could sue him for damages, emotional distress, legal fees, the whole 9 yards." I sat there with my hands folded in my lap and felt the magnitude of it settle over me like a weight that was somehow also freedom, the realization that this wasn't just family drama that I was being dramatic about. This was actually criminal, actually serious, actually something that the legal system recognized as wrong, even if my family never had. "What are my options?" I asked, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. Sounded like the voice I used in board meetings when I was presenting analysis that I knew was correct, even if it contradicted what everyone wanted to hear. Jessica leaned back in her chair and laid it out methodically. Option 1 was purely civil, sue him for the money plus damages, longer process, but I'd have control over it. Option 2 was criminal charges. File a police report and let the state prosecute, faster but less control over outcomes. Option 3 was both. Pursue criminal charges for justice and civil suit for guaranteed financial recovery. And the way she explained it made each path feel real and possible, instead of like some fantasy of standing up for myself that would evaporate when I actually tried. "The thing you need to understand," she said, and her voice was gentler now, like she could see the war happening inside me, "is that he made a choice. He stole from you without hesitation, forged your signature, lied to your face repeatedly, and he did it betting that you wouldn't fight back, that family loyalty or fear or whatever he's trained you to feel would keep you quiet. So this idea that you pursuing justice makes you the bad guy, that's manipulation. That's part of the same system that let him feel entitled to your inheritance in the first place." I felt tears prick my eyes because nobody had ever said it that clearly, had ever named the dynamic that had shaped my entire life, and I thought about Dad's last words about not letting people take advantage of my kindness, and realized that pursuing this wasn't cruelty. It was finally learning the difference between kindness and letting myself be destroyed. We filed the police report that afternoon at the downtown precinct, And the detective who took my case was a weathered man in his 50s named Murphy, who'd apparently seen every kind of fraud there was. And when I walked him through everything, showed him the security footage, the forged check, the timeline of Marcus's lies, I watched his expression shift from professional interest to something harder, and he said, "You've done most of my job for me. This is the most documented case I've seen in months. And I'll tell you something, family financial abuse is more common than people think. We just don't see it prosecuted often because victims feel guilty or families pressure them to drop it. But this is theft, clear as day, and you have every right to pursue it." He made some calls while I sat in the interview room, came back 20 minutes later, and told me that Marcus had a record I didn't know about. Nothing major but a credit card fraud charge from 5 years ago that got pleaded down and expunged. And more recently, there were credit cards opened in Mom's name that she'd apparently paid off quietly without ever reporting it, and seeing that pattern laid out in black and white, understanding that this wasn't an isolated mistake, but a established behavior that my family had been enabling for years, I felt the last piece of my guilt crack and fall away. Because I wasn't ruining his life over one bad choice, I was finally holding him accountable for a pattern of choices that everyone else had decided to ignore. And maybe if someone had stopped him years ago, had let him face real consequences instead of cleaning up his messes and making excuses, he wouldn't be the person who could steal $75,000 from his own sister and sleep fine at night. Mom returned from her cruise on a Wednesday afternoon with stories about Alaskan glaciers and excursion schedules that I listened to over the phone while staring at the folder of evidence sitting on my Seattle kitchen counter, and I didn't tell her about the investigation or the police report or Detective Murphy's confirmation that Marcus would be charged within the week, because there was a family dinner planned for Saturday night at Sorella, the upscale Italian restaurant downtown, where we'd celebrated Mom's last 3 birthdays. And I wanted Marcus there, wanted him comfortable and unsuspecting when everything came crashing down around him. Jessica had advised against a public confrontation, said it could complicate the prosecution if Marcus felt ambushed, but I'd made it clear that this wasn't negotiable. That I'd spent 29 years being the one who stayed quiet while Marcus performed his golden child routine, and I needed him to face what he'd done in front of the family that had enabled it. And she'd finally agreed as long as I coordinated with Detective Murphy, who would be available if things escalated beyond my control. The guest list was small and deliberate. Mom and Marcus, obviously. Marcus's girlfriend Brittany, who I'd met twice, and who seemed nice enough in that performative way of someone who hadn't yet figured out who she was dating, and Dad's siblings Uncle James and Aunt Carol, who'd always treated me with the kind of straightforward affection that made Mom's favoritism even more obvious by contrast, who'd driven down from Seattle for my college graduation when Mom had skipped it because Marcus had a softball tournament, who'd sent flowers to my new apartment and gift cards for my promotions, and remembered my birthday without prompting. I spent Thursday night going through the evidence again, organizing it into a folder that would fit in my purse, printed copies of the security footage stills, the forged check from the bank, the timeline I'd created documenting Marcus's lies, the receipts showing the payments I'd been making on his behalf for Mom's house expenses that she didn't even know about. And I felt like I was preparing for a board presentation, except the stakes were my entire family dynamic, and the outcome would either validate everything I'd been feeling my whole life or confirm that I was the problem, like they'd always implied. Friday, I took off work and drove down to Portland. Spent the night at a hotel instead of Mom's house because I couldn't trust myself to act normal around Marcus if I saw him before Saturday, and I called my best friend Rachel, who lived in Denver now but had known my family since high school, had witnessed countless dinners where my achievements were dismissed and Marcus's mediocrity was celebrated, and she said, "You deserve this, Emma. You deserve to watch him face what he did, and he deserves every single consequence that's coming." And hearing someone say it out loud, say that I deserve justice instead of just being understanding one more time, made me cry in a way I hadn't let myself cry since finding that security footage. Saturday morning, I chose my outfit like armor, a navy blue dress that I wore to client presentations, professional and put together and successful, paired with the pearl earrings Dad had given me for my master's degree graduation, and I looked at myself in the hotel mirror and practiced saying the words I'd been rehearsing all week. Did my inheritance check ever arrive at the house, Marcus? Keeping my voice level and calm the way I'd learned to do in meetings when men talked over me or dismissed my analysis. And I barely recognized the woman looking back at me because somewhere between finding that footage and filing that police report, I'd stopped being the daughter who absorbed everyone's disappointment and started being someone who knew her own worth. The drive to Sorella took 20 minutes through downtown Portland traffic, and with every block I felt my heart rate increase. Felt the adrenaline start to kick in, mixed with something that might have been fear or might have been anticipation. And I remembered every family dinner where I'd sat quietly while Marcus dominated the conversation, every achievement of mine that had been met with, "That's nice, dear," while his most basic accomplishments were celebrated like Nobel Prizes. Every time I'd wanted to scream that I mattered too, but had swallowed it down because making waves wasn't what good daughters did. I pulled into the parking lot at exactly 6:30, saw Mom's car already there, and Marcus's new truck, the silver Ford F-150 that he'd bought with my $75,000. And I sat in my car for 5 minutes with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply and thinking about Dad's last words. Don't let them take advantage of your kindness. Understanding now that he'd known this moment would come, had maybe hoped for it, had left me that inheritance not just as money, but as permission to finally stop accepting less than I deserved. Walking into the restaurant, I spotted them immediately at a large round table near the windows. Marcus laughing loudly at something with his arm around Brittany, Mom already sipping wine and looking pleased with herself, Uncle James and Aunt Carol studying their menus, and I watched them for just a moment before anyone noticed me, watched the tableau of my family with Marcus at the center like always, and I felt the last piece of my guilt dissolve because I knew with absolute certainty that what I was about to do wasn't cruelty. It was finally standing up for myself the way nobody else ever had. Mom spotted me first and waved enthusiastically, and I crossed the restaurant with my purse heavy against my hip, carrying the folder of evidence that would detonate everything. And when I reached the table, Mom immediately stood to hug me, pulling back to look at me with that critical eye she'd perfected over decades, saying, "Oh, Emma, you really should do something different with your hair. That style is so severe." Then turning to Brittany with warmth she never used with me. "Doesn't Brittany look lovely in that dress? Such a beautiful color on her." And I felt the familiar sting of it, the casual cruelty disguised as observation. But tonight, it just rolled off me because I knew what was coming, and nothing she said could touch me anymore. I took the empty seat between Uncle James and Aunt Carol, directly across from Marcus, who was scrolling through his phone with that easy confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. And he looked up long enough to say, "Hey, Em," with barely any interest before returning to his screen, and I watched him for a moment, this 32-year-old man who still acted like the world owed him everything, who'd stolen $75,000 from his own sister and slept just fine, who was about to show everyone at this table photos of the truck he'd bought with my inheritance while I sat there and smiled. Uncle James asked me about work with genuine interest, the way he always did, and I told him about my recent promotion to senior analyst, about the major client account I'd just secured, and I saw his face light up with pride, saw him start to ask a follow-up question, and then Mom's voice cut across the table like she hadn't even heard me speak. "That's nice, dear. But Marcus, you haven't told everyone about your new position yet. Tell them about the promotion." And Marcus launched into this elaborate description of what was actually just a lateral move at the supply company where he'd worked for 8 months, his longest employment stint in 3 years, overselling it with terms like increased responsibility and leadership opportunity that I knew from my own corporate experience meant absolutely nothing. Brittany hung on every word like he was describing a Fortune 500 CEO role, touching his arm and saying, "He's being modest. They specifically sought him out for this. They said he was the only one who could handle it." And I wondered if she actually believed it, or if this was just the role she'd accepted, the supportive girlfriend who propped up his fragile ego. And I felt something like pity for her because she didn't know yet who she was dating, didn't know that the new truck he'd shown her with such pride was bought with money he'd stolen, didn't know that everything about Marcus was a performance built on other people's money and other people's excuses. The server came and took our orders, and I barely looked at the menu, just pointed at something random because I knew I wouldn't be able to eat. My stomach was already twisted in knots of anticipation and adrenaline, and I sipped water while conversation flowed around me. Mom talking about her cruise, Aunt Carol asking about the house maintenance, Marcus pulling out his phone to show everyone photos of his truck from different angles, zooming in on features and talking about the sound system and the towing capacity, and I watched him do it, watched him show off my $75,000 like it was his achievement, like he'd earned it through hard work instead of theft and forgery. And I felt my anger crystallize into something cold and clear and powerful, felt myself preparing for what came next. And when he passed his phone to Mom so she could see the photos better, gushing about how proud she was that he was finally getting his life together, I caught Uncle James's eye across the table and saw something there. Some flicker of doubt or discomfort, like maybe he'd been wondering the same things I had about Marcus's sudden windfall, and I knew that when this all came out, at least some people at this table would believe me, would see what I'd been seeing my whole life. The appetizers had just arrived when Mom set down her wine glass and said with that satisfied tone she used when she thought everything was going according to plan, "Well, at least the estate settlement is all handled smoothly, one less thing to worry about." And I felt my pulse spike because this was it. This was the opening I'd been waiting for. And I set down my water glass carefully and said in a voice that came out steadier than I felt, "Actually, I need to discuss something about that." And the table went quiet in that sudden way that happens when the energy shifts, when people sense something important is about to be said, and I saw Marcus's head snap up from his phone, saw his eyes focus on me with an alertness that hadn't been there moments before, saw him register the tone in my voice and sit up straighter, like some part of him knew what was coming, even if he couldn't admit it to himself. "What about it?" Mom asked with mild curiosity, and I turned to look directly at Marcus across the table, held his gaze, and asked the question I'd been rehearsing for days. "Did my inheritance check ever arrive at the house, Marcus?" And I watched his face, watched the micro-expressions that crossed it in the split second before he composed himself, the flash of panic quickly covered by confusion, and he shook his head and said with practiced ease, "No. I never saw anything like that. Are you missing it? You should call the attorney. Maybe it got lost in the mail." And his performance was good. I had to give him that. The concerned brother trying to be helpful, and Brittany even touched his arm sympathetically, like he was being so kind to worry about my problem. "Interesting," I said, and I heard my own voice like it was coming from someone else, calm and clear and powerful. "Because according to the bank records, it was cashed 3 months ago, 5 days after it was mailed to the house." And I watched the color drain slightly from Marcus's face even as he maintained his expression of confusion, and he said, "That's impossible. There must be some mistake. Maybe it was identity theft or something. That happens all the time." And Mom immediately jumped in with, "Oh, Emma, how awful, you poor thing. We should report this. Someone stole your inheritance." And she was looking at me with what she probably thought was sympathy, but I could see she was already planning how to handle this, how to make it go away quickly so it wouldn't disrupt her perfect family narrative. I let the moment hang there for just a beat. Let them all think maybe that was the explanation, that some stranger had stolen from me. And then I said quietly, "I did report it, Mom. I filed a police report 2 weeks ago." And the table went absolutely silent. Uncle James's fork frozen halfway to his mouth, Aunt Carol's eyes widening, Brittany looking confused, and Marcus staring at me with something new in his expression, something that might have been fear, or might have been rage, or might have been the dawning realization that I wasn't going to stay quiet this time. That the sister who always absorbed everything and never made waves was done protecting him from himself, And I reached into my purse and pulled out the printed screenshot I'd prepared. The image from the security camera showing Marcus clear as day at the mailbox, and I placed it on the table where everyone could see it and said, "This is from the security cameras at the house, the ones Dad set up. The footage is time-stamped and date-stamped, and that's you, Marcus, taking the envelope with my name on it, the envelope that contained my $75,000 inheritance check." I reached across the table and slid the printed screenshot toward Mom, my hand steady even though my heart was hammering, and I said, "This is from the security cameras at the house, the ones Dad set up 2 years ago." And I watched her pick it up with trembling fingers, watched her eyes scan the image where Marcus was clearly visible standing at the mailbox, his face turned just enough toward the camera that there was no question of identity, the white envelope in his hands with my name visible even in the printed resolution, and I saw the exact moment recognition hit her, the way her mouth opened slightly and her eyes went wide, and she looked from the photo to Marcus and back again, and said in a voice that cracked, "Marcus, what is this?" And Marcus was already shaking his head, already scrambling for an explanation, and he said, "I was going to give it to her. I just forgot. I put it aside and it slipped my mind." But his voice had that edge of panic now, the smooth confidence completely gone, and I felt something fierce and bright burning in my chest as I said, "You forgot about $75,000? You forgot so thoroughly that you took it to the bank, forged my signature, and cashed it?" And I reached into my purse again and pulled out the second document, the copy of the cashed check that the bank had provided, and I placed it on the table next to the security photo, and the signature was there in black and white, a clumsy approximation of my handwriting that wouldn't have fooled anyone who actually looked. And Uncle James leaned forward to examine both documents, his face growing harder with each second, and he said quietly, "Marcus, this is felony fraud." And Brittany was staring at Marcus like she'd never seen him before, her face pale, and she said in a small voice, "Marcus, you told me your year-end bonus paid for the truck. You said it was from your company." And I saw something shift in Marcus's expression, saw him realize he was losing control of the narrative, and he tried to pivot, saying, "Emma, this is between family. We don't need to air this out here. Don't make a scene." And I felt something break inside me. Felt 30 years of being told to be quieter, to be more understanding, to make myself smaller so Marcus could be bigger. And I said in a voice that carried across our table and probably to the ones nearby, "You made this scene when you stole from me, when you forged my signature on a $75,000 check and spent it on yourself without a second thought." And I saw Mom flinch at my tone, saw other diners starting to glance our way, and Marcus's face was flushing red now, his jaw tight, and Uncle James was still studying the documents with a prosecutor's careful eye, and Aunt Carol reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, and I realized I was shaking, but not from fear, from the sheer adrenaline of finally saying out loud what had been done to me, of refusing to protect him from the consequences of his own choices. And Marcus was looking at me like I'd betrayed him, like I was the one who'd done something unforgivable. And I looked right back at him and thought about every time I'd stayed quiet, every time I'd absorbed the hurt and moved on, and I knew I would never do that again. Marcus tried to recover control, leaning forward with his palms up in what I recognized as his placating gesture, the one he used when he was trying to manipulate a situation back in his favor. And he said, "I was going to pay you back, Emma. I just needed a little time to get the funds together." And I felt something cold and sharp cut through the adrenaline, because even now, even caught completely, he was still lying. And I said, "With what money, Marcus? You're 3 months behind on your share of Mom's expenses." And I watched his face freeze, watched Mom's head whip toward him, and she said in a voice that trembled, "What? Marcus, you said you paid those. You showed me—" And I cut her off gently. "He showed you something, Mom, but he didn't pay anything. I've been covering his portion since July." And I reached into my purse one more time and pulled out the folder I'd prepared, the copies of the checks I'd written, the payment confirmations, the records showing that the $1,500 a month Marcus was supposed to contribute toward the mortgage and utilities on the house he still lived in had come entirely from my account, and I laid them on the table next to the security footage and the forged check, a growing pile of evidence of exactly who my brother was, and Mom was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language, and I said quietly, "That's $4,200 over 3 months, money I paid without telling you because Marcus kept promising he'd pay me back, and I didn't want to worry you." And I could see other diners at nearby tables had given up any pretense of not listening. Could see a woman 2 tables over with her hand over her mouth. Could see the waiter standing frozen near the kitchen with a tray in his hands. And Aunt Carol said in a voice that carried across our section of the restaurant, "Let her speak. For once in your lives, let her speak." And I looked at my aunt and saw tears in her eyes, saw Uncle James reach over and take her hand, and I felt something unlock in my chest because someone was finally bearing witness to this. Someone was finally saying that I deserved to be heard, and I turned back to Marcus and said, "This isn't just about the check. This is about a pattern, about you borrowing money and never returning it, about you taking my things and dismissing it as no big deal, about you treating me like I exist to subsidize your life." And Marcus's face was bright red now, his jaw clenched, and he snapped, "You always act so superior with your big career and your fancy Seattle apartment, like you're so much better than everyone else." And I felt the words hit me like they always did, felt that old trained response to shrink back and apologize. But then I thought about the security footage, about his face so casual and entitled as he took my inheritance, about 3 months of lies, and I said clearly, loudly enough that I knew the whole section could hear, "I act like someone who pays their debts and doesn't steal from family. If that makes me superior, then I guess I am." And I saw Mom flinch, saw Brittany push back slightly from the table like she wanted to distance herself from Marcus. And I saw something flicker across Uncle James's face that might have been pride. Marcus tried a different tactic then, and I watched him physically shift in his chair, his expression morphing into something that was meant to look sincere and wounded. And he said, "Dad would have wanted us to work this out privately, as a family. He wouldn't have wanted you dragging the police into this." And I felt something white-hot and clarifying surge through me, because he was using Dad now, using the man whose death had given him the opportunity to steal from me in the first place. And I leaned forward and said in a voice that came out harder than I'd ever heard from myself, "Dad specifically left that money to me, Marcus. He knew the difference between us. He knew exactly who you were and who I was, and that's why his will was so specific." And I saw him flinch like I'd struck him, and Mom was gripping the edge of the table with both hands. And she said in a shaky voice that sounded like she was trying to restore order to a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her control, "Can't we handle this at home, Emma? Please, we don't need to do this here with everyone watching." And I looked at my mother and felt 30 years of being asked to be smaller, to be quieter, to handle things privately so that Marcus's reputation wouldn't suffer. And I said clearly, "I tried to handle it privately, Mom. I asked Marcus twice if any mail had come for me. I gave him 2 opportunities to tell me the truth, and he looked me in the eye both times and lied." And right then I saw Detective Murphy entering the restaurant, scanning the dining room until his eyes found our table. And I felt my heart rate spike, even though I'd known he was coming because I'd texted him the location 20 minutes ago when I'd gone to the bathroom, and Marcus saw him at almost the same moment I did, saw this tall man in a dark suit with a detective's badge clipped to his belt approaching our table with purpose, and the color drained from Marcus's face so completely that he looked gray in the restaurant's warm lighting, and Detective Murphy stopped at our table and said in a professional but carrying voice, "Mr. Castellano? I'm Detective Murphy with the Fraud Division. We spoke on the phone earlier this week. I need to discuss some check fraud charges that have been filed." And the restaurant had gone almost completely silent now, conversations at nearby tables dying as people turned to watch. And I could see the manager standing near the host stand with a phone in his hand, looking uncertain about whether he should intervene. And Marcus was staring at me with an expression of complete betrayal, his mouth working for a moment before he managed to say, "You called the cops? You actually called the cops on your own brother?" And his voice cracked on the last word, like I was the one who had done something unthinkable. Like my calling the police was a greater sin than his stealing $75,000 from me. And I looked at him and felt absolutely no urge to apologize or soften or explain. And I said in a voice that was steady and clear and loud enough that everyone in our section could hear, "You committed multiple felonies against your own sister, Marcus. You stole my inheritance. You forged my signature. You lied to my face repeatedly, and you spent months enjoying the benefits of your theft, while I grieved Dad and wondered why his final gift to me had never arrived." Detective Murphy pulled a small notepad from his jacket pocket, and I watched Marcus's eyes track the movement, like he was watching a weapon being drawn, and the detective said in that same professional carrying voice, "Mr. Castellano, based on the evidence we've reviewed, we're looking at several charges including mail theft, which is a federal offense, forgery of an endorsement on a financial instrument, and bank fraud, and combined these charges carry a potential sentence of 5 to 10 years in federal prison." And I watched the words hit Marcus like physical blows, watched his face cycle through disbelief and panic, and then land on something desperate. And he turned to Mom and said, "Mom, tell her to drop this. Tell her this is insane. I'm your son." And his voice had taken on a pleading quality I'd never heard from him before. This man who'd always been so confident and certain of his place in the family hierarchy, and Mom was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she looked between Marcus and me, and she said in a voice that shook, "Emma, please, he's your brother. Surely we can work something out. Surely there's a way to handle this without destroying his entire life." And I felt that old familiar pressure to fold, to prioritize his well-being over my own hurt, to be the understanding one. But then Uncle James's voice cut through the moment, sharp and clear, and he said, "Linda, he stole $75,000 from her. He forged legal documents. He lied repeatedly to her face. And you're asking Emma to compromise?" And Aunt Carol added in a voice that was thick with emotion, "And you're asking her to compromise? Again? Like always? When does it become Marcus's turn to face consequences for his choices?" And I looked at my aunt and saw 30 years of witnessing this dynamic reflected in her face, and I felt something settle in my chest, something solid and unmovable. And I said to my mother in a voice that was steady despite the way my hands were shaking, "I'm done being the one who compromises, Mom. I'm done being the one who has to understand and forgive and make allowances while Marcus does whatever he wants." And right then, Brittany stood up from the table, gathering her purse with trembling hands, and she said quietly without looking at anyone, "I can't be part of this. I'm sorry." And I watched her walk away through the restaurant, watched Marcus's head swivel to track her departure, and I saw something crack in his expression as he realized his girlfriend was leaving, as the full scope of consequences started to become real to him, and Mom was still crying, and she said in a voice that was almost a wail, "This is going to destroy our family, Emma. How can we come back from this?" And I looked at my mother and felt 30 years of hurt and dismissal and being made smaller rise up in my throat, and I said clearly, loudly enough that I knew everyone nearby could hear, "Marcus destroyed our family when he decided to steal from me, when he decided his wants were more important than my grief or my trust or my financial security. I'm just refusing to pretend it didn't happen anymore." Detective Murphy looked at Marcus with an expression that was professionally neutral, but somehow final, and he said, "Mr. Castellano, you can come with me to the station voluntarily right now, or I can place you under arrest here in front of everyone, but either way we need to go." And I watched Marcus's face cycle through several expressions before landing on something that looked like cornered desperation, and he stood up from the table with movements that seemed decades older than his 32 years. And as he passed my chair, he stopped and looked down at me with an expression of pure hatred, and he said in a low voice that shook with rage, "I hope you're proud of yourself, Emma. I hope destroying your own brother makes you feel like the good person you've always pretended to be." And I looked up at him and felt absolutely nothing shift in my resolve, and Detective Murphy put a hand on Marcus's arm and said, "That's enough. Let's go." And I watched them walk through the restaurant toward the exit, watched every head in the dining room turn to follow their progress, and then they were gone, and the restaurant was filled with the kind of thick silence that follows a public spectacle, and I turned back to the table to find my mother staring at me with tears streaming down her face, and she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper but somehow felt like an accusation, "How could you do this to him, Emma? How could you call the police on your own brother? He's going to jail because of you." And something that had been coiled tight in my chest for 30 years finally snapped, and I heard myself say in a voice that came out louder than I'd intended, "How could you always choose him over me, Mom? How could you spend my entire life making excuses for him while dismissing everything I ever achieved?" And she opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. And I found myself listing examples that I hadn't even consciously remembered I'd been carrying. And I said, "You missed my college graduation because Marcus had a hangover and needed you to bring him soup. You told me not to make a fuss about making senior analyst at 27 because Marcus was sensitive about his job situation. You asked me not to talk about buying my condo because it might make him feel bad about still living at home. And when I told you I'd been promoted to 6 figures, you changed the subject after 30 seconds to ask if I thought Marcus seemed depressed." And my mother's face was crumbling, and she said, "Emma, I never meant," and I said, "You never meant to make me feel worthless, but you did it anyway, over and over, because it was easier to expect me to understand than to expect Marcus to do better." And she was openly crying now, and she said in a voice that sounded like something breaking, "I didn't realize, Emma. I swear I didn't realize I was doing that." And I felt Uncle James's hand on my shoulder, and he said in a voice that was thick with emotion, "Your father worried about exactly this, Emma. He told me 3 weeks before he died that he was afraid Marcus would try to take advantage after he was gone. He said he'd made the will very specific because he knew Marcus would need that boundary, and he knew Linda would try to smooth things over." And I turned to look at my uncle and felt something crack in my chest because Dad had known, Dad had seen this pattern, and had tried to protect me even from beyond the grave. And Aunt Carol stood up and came around the table and pulled me into a hug, and she said clearly, "We're so proud of you, Emma. What you did tonight took more courage than most people ever have to find, and your father would be proud too." 2 weeks later, I sat in the office of Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen and watched him spread photographs across his desk like he was laying out a winning hand of cards. And there was the security footage from my parents' house showing Marcus taking the envelope. There was the forged check with my badly imitated signature. There was the bank surveillance showing Marcus at the teller window, and Chen said in a voice that carried the confidence of someone who'd prosecuted hundreds of fraud cases, "Ms. Castellano, this is one of the most well-documented cases I've handled. Your brother was formally charged yesterday with mail theft, forgery, and bank fraud, and he initially entered a not guilty plea." And I felt something twist in my stomach, because even with all the evidence, Marcus was still going to make this difficult, still going to force me to prove what we both knew was true. And Chen must have seen something in my face because he said, "His attorney called me this morning. They want to discuss a plea agreement. No defense lawyer with any sense would take this to trial with this much evidence." And I nodded and felt Detective Murphy's presence beside me. He'd become something like an ally through this process, and he said, "We also executed a search warrant on Marcus's residence and storage unit, and we found several items that appear to match the description of your father's vintage watch collection that was specifically bequeathed to you in the will." And I felt the air leave my lungs because I'd completely forgotten about Dad's watches. He'd been a collector for 30 years and had explicitly left them to me in a separate codicary to his will, and I heard myself say, "I never even thought to ask about those. I assumed Mom had them stored safely." And Detective Murphy's expression was sympathetic as he said, "We inventoried 17 watches, several of them quite valuable, and we found receipts showing your brother sold 6 watches to various dealers and private collectors over the past 4 months for a total of approximately $15,000. And I closed my eyes and saw my father's hands winding his favorite omega, heard his voice explaining the history of each piece, and I felt a fresh wave of betrayal wash over me, because it wasn't even about the money anymore. It was about Marcus taking these pieces of Dad and converting them to cash without a single thought about what they meant. Chen was talking again, and I forced myself to focus, and he said, "We're adding theft charges related to the watches. And given the total value of what he's stolen, we're looking at enhanced sentencing guidelines. But Ms. Castellano, I want to prepare you for the plea negotiation. He's going to want reduced charges in exchange for pleading guilty and agreeing to full restitution." And I said quietly, "What does that mean in practical terms?" And Chen leaned back in his chair and said, "Probably 18 months to 2 years in federal prison, 5 years probation, and a restitution order for the full amount plus interest and your legal expenses, which we're calculating at approximately $90,000 total." And the number hung in the air between us. And I thought about how Marcus's truck had cost $45,000, how he'd spent my inheritance on a vehicle and watches he'd sold for pennies on the dollar, and probably blown on who knows what else. And Detective Murphy said, "I did some additional investigation into your brother's background, Ms. Castellano, and I found something you should know about." And he slid another document across the desk, and I saw it was a credit report in my mother's name. And there were 3 credit cards I'd never heard her mention, with a combined balance of $18,000. And Murphy said, "These were opened over the past 2 years with your mother's information. The addresses were set to your brother's email, and the charges are all his, based on the merchant records we subpoenaed. And your mother has been making minimum payments, but she told me she thought they were cards she'd forgotten about. She didn't realize they were fraudulent accounts." And I stared at the paper and felt something calcify in my chest, because this wasn't one mistake or one moment of weakness. This was a pattern of Marcus manipulating and stealing from his own family. And I remembered my attorney Jessica Thornton saying, "People who do this once do it habitually. Financial abuse within families rarely happens in isolation." And here was the proof spread across Chen's desk in black and white and full-color photographs. Marcus accepted the plea agreement 3 weeks after our meeting with the prosecutor, and his attorney called Jessica Thornton to inform us that Marcus would plead guilty to federal mail theft, forgery, bank fraud, and grand theft in exchange for a recommended sentence of 18 months in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. And the agreement included a restitution order for $90,000 that covered the inheritance, the watches, interest, and my legal fees. And Jessica told me that the sentencing hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock in the federal courthouse downtown. And she said, "The prosecutor wants to know if you'd like to deliver a victim impact statement. You're not required to, but it gives you a chance to tell the judge how this affected you." And I sat in her office and felt something twist in my chest, because part of me wanted to stand up in court and make Marcus hear every single thing his theft had cost me, but another part of me just wanted it to be over. And I finally said, "Yes, I want to make a statement." Because I realized this might be the only time in my entire life that Marcus would be forced to actually listen to me without interrupting or dismissing or turning to Mom for rescue. The courthouse on Thursday morning was exactly what I'd expected from every legal drama I'd ever watched. All marble floors and high ceilings, and the particular kind of echoing quiet that comes from people speaking in hushed voices about serious things. And I sat in the gallery beside Jessica while we waited for Marcus's case to be called, and I watched other defendants stand before the judge and wondered if they all felt this same sick mixture of vindication and sorrow. And then the bailiff called, "United States versus Marcus James Castellano." And I watched my brother walk into the courtroom wearing a dark suit that I'd never seen before and that probably belonged to his attorney. And he looked smaller somehow, diminished, and he wouldn't meet my eyes as he stood before the judge with his hands clasped in front of him like a penitent schoolboy. Judge Patricia Williamson was a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every excuse and lie that defendants could possibly invent. And she reviewed the plea agreement while the courtroom held its collective breath. And then she said, "Mr. Castellano, You're pleading guilty to 4 felony counts. Do you understand that you're waiving your right to a trial and that I could sentence you to more than the recommended 18 months if I find the recommendation inadequate?" And Marcus said in a voice that was barely audible, "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." And the judge turned to the prosecutor and said, "I understand the victim wishes to make a statement." And I felt Jessica's hand on my arm as I stood up and walked to the podium that faced the judge's bench, and I'd written out what I wanted to say and revised it probably 20 times. But now, with the paper in my hands and Marcus standing 15 feet away, I found myself setting the prepared statement aside and just speaking from the raw place that had been bleeding for months. I said, "Your Honor, my brother stole $75,000 from me, and he stole watches that belonged to our father and that were left specifically to me, and those are the facts of the case. But what's harder to quantify is what it feels like to discover that someone you've loved and defended and made excuses for your entire life thinks so little of you that he can steal from you without hesitation and then lie to your face about it repeatedly." And my voice was steady, even though my hands were shaking, and I said, "Marcus didn't steal from a stranger. He stole from his sister while she was grieving their father. And he did it casually, like it was his right, like the cameras wouldn't catch him, or like it didn't matter if they did, because surely Emma will understand. Emma always understands. Emma always makes things easier." And I felt tears on my face, but I didn't stop talking. And I said, "This wasn't just theft. It was a betrayal of every time I covered for him, or helped him, or stayed quiet, when our mother made me smaller so he could feel bigger. And what I want the court to understand is that he had months to come clean, months to apologize, months to make this right before I had to involve the police, and he chose to keep lying every single time." And I finally looked at Marcus, and his face was red, and he was staring at the floor, and I said, "I don't know if he's sorry for what he did, or just sorry he got caught, but either way, I needed him to face consequences, because enabling his behavior wasn't kindness. It was just teaching him that he could hurt people without cost." Judge Williamson listened to my entire statement without interrupting, and when I finished and walked back to my seat on shaking legs, she turned to Marcus and said, "Mr. Castellano, would you like to address the court?" And Marcus's attorney whispered something to him, and Marcus stood and said in a voice that carried more self-pity than remorse, "Your Honor, I know what I did was wrong, and I'm sorry. I was going through a difficult time financially, and I made a terrible decision, and I never meant to hurt my sister. I was planning to pay her back, but things got complicated." And I felt Jessica stiffen beside me, because even now Marcus was making excuses. Even now he was framing this as one mistake rather than a pattern of manipulation. And Judge Williamson's expression hardened, and she said, "Mr. Castellano, you had approximately 3 months between stealing your sister's inheritance and this case coming to light. And in that time you purchased a truck. You sold family heirlooms, and you continued to lie to your sister's face when she directly asked you about the check, so I'm not convinced you were planning to pay her back at all. I think you only regret getting caught." And Marcus opened his mouth and closed it again, and the judge said, "This court accepts your guilty plea and sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, and you are ordered to pay full restitution of $90,000 on a schedule to be determined by the probation office." And Mr. Castellano, I want to be very clear that this wasn't just a theft. This was an exploitation of family trust and grief. And if you violate any term of your probation, I will not hesitate to impose the maximum remaining sentence. And she brought her gavel down with a crack that seemed to echo through my entire body. And then the bailiff was leading Marcus toward a side door. And just before he disappeared, he looked back at me one time with an expression I couldn't read. And then he was gone, and I was sitting in the courthouse gallery, feeling absolutely nothing like what I'd expected to feel. 3 days after the sentencing, I sat in my Seattle apartment and stared at the city lights through my window and waited to feel something that made sense, because I'd expected triumph or at least relief, but instead, I felt hollowed out and strangely unmoored, like I'd been bracing against a door for so long that when it finally opened, I stumbled forward into empty space. I'd taken the week off work and told my boss I needed time to process some family matters. And she'd been understanding in that careful way people are when they sense darkness, but don't want to pry. And I spent those days moving through my apartment like a ghost, making coffee I didn't drink, and starting books I couldn't focus on. And on the fourth day, I finally called Dr. Sarah Mendez, the therapist my friend Rachel had been recommending for months. And I said, I think I need help processing something, which felt like the understatement of the year. Dr. Mendez had an opening that same afternoon, which felt like either fate or desperation on her part for clients. But I didn't care which because by 2 o'clock I was sitting in her office with its soft gray walls and the kind of comfortable chairs that seemed designed to make you cry, and she asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I started talking and didn't stop for 45 minutes, and when I finally finished with, and now he's in prison, and I feel like I should be happy, but I just feel empty. She nodded like I'd said something that made perfect sense and said, Emma, justice and healing aren't the same thing. Justice is external. It's about accountability and consequences in the world. But healing is internal. It's about repairing what was damaged in you. And what I'm hearing is that getting justice was necessary, but it didn't automatically undo 30 years of family dynamics that taught you that your worth was conditional and secondary. I felt something crack open in my chest, because she'd articulated what I'd been circling around for days, and I said, I thought if he finally faced consequences, I'd feel vindicated. I'd feel like I mattered. And Dr. Mendez leaned forward slightly and said, But you're realizing that your worth can't come from his punishment any more than it could come from your family's approval. It has to come from inside you, and that's harder work than gathering evidence or making statements in court. We sat with that for a moment, and I felt tears sliding down my face. And she said, The justice you pursued was important. It was necessary. It was you finally saying that you deserved protection and fairness. But now comes the second part, which is believing you deserved those things all along, not because you proved it in court, but because you're inherently valuable. I drove home from that session feeling raw and exposed, but also something else. Something that felt like the beginning of understanding, and that night I sat at my kitchen table and thought about my father and the inheritance he'd left me, and I realized for the first time that the money wasn't just financial support. It was his final message, his way of saying you deserve security and freedom and the ability to build a life on your own terms. And he'd known that Marcus would probably try something, which was why he'd been so specific in the will, and the inheritance wasn't just money. It was permission to value myself even when my family didn't. 2 days later, my mother called and asked if we could meet for lunch, and her voice on the phone was tentative in a way I'd never heard before, and I almost said no because I wasn't sure I had the emotional energy, but something made me say, okay, Saturday at noon, and we met at a small cafe halfway between her new apartment and my place. And when I arrived, she was already there looking smaller and older than I remembered. And she stood when she saw me and said, Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. And we sat down, and there was this awful awkward silence before she said, Emma, I've been thinking about what you said at the restaurant, about how I always chose Marcus over you, and I need you to know that I've started seeing a therapist because I'm realizing how much damage I did. I watched her face and saw genuine anguish there, and she said, I told myself for years that Marcus needed more help, that he was struggling and you were fine, that you were so capable and independent that you didn't need the same attention, but what I was really doing was making you invisible. I was making you smaller so I didn't have to deal with his problems, and I'm so sorry. And her voice broke on the last word, and I felt my own tears starting because this was what I'd needed for 30 years. Not perfection, but acknowledgement. Not excuses, but honest accountability. She reached across the table and took my hand and said, I enabled him. I taught him that he could treat you badly, and I'd make excuses. I taught you that your job was to be understanding and accommodating, and I destroyed something between you that should have been sacred. and we sat there crying in this cafe while other patrons pretended not to notice. And I said, I don't know if I can forgive everything right away. This is 30 years of hurt, but I appreciate you finally seeing it. And she nodded and said, I don't expect immediate forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I'm facing what I did. I'm not hiding from it anymore. We talked for 2 hours, and it wasn't perfect, and there were moments of defensiveness on both sides. But it was honest in a way our relationship had never been. And when we finally left the cafe, I felt exhausted, but also cautiously hopeful, like maybe we could build something different if we both kept working at it. The next week, Uncle James called and said he had something for me, and when I met him at his house, he handed me a cardboard box that smelled like my father's cologne, and he said, These are your dad's journals. He kept them sporadically over the years, and I found some entries about you that I thought you should read. And I took the box home with shaking hands and spent that entire evening reading my father's handwriting. And there on the pages dated 3 years ago, he'd written, Emma called today to tell me about her promotion. She sounded so happy and proud, and Linda barely acknowledged it at dinner, just changed the subject to Marcus's latest crisis. And I wanted to say something, but I've never been good at standing up to Linda's favoritism, and I hate myself for that. I hate that I let Emma grow up thinking she was less important. And I read those words over and over, and then I found an entry from a year before he died that said, I'm worried about what will happen after I'm gone. Marcus will try to take advantage, he always does, and Emma will probably let him because she's been trained to accommodate, so I'm changing my will to be very specific about her inheritance, and I'm telling James to watch over her, to make sure she finally stands up for herself because she deserves so much more than this family has given her. 3 months after Marcus's sentencing, I received a notification from the probation office that the first restitution payment had been processed, and when I checked my bank account, there was a deposit for $1,200, which was just the beginning of what would be a long payment schedule. But seeing that money appear felt less like victory and more like a strange kind of closure, like the legal system was finally acknowledging in concrete terms that I'd been wronged. My mother called that same week and told me she'd made a decision about the family house, the 4-bedroom colonial where Marcus and I had grown up and where she'd been living alone since Dad died. And she said, It's too big for just me, and honestly, every room reminds me of mistakes I made, so I'm selling it. And I felt a complicated mix of sadness and relief because that house held 30 years of memories both tender and painful. When the house sold 6 weeks later for $420,000, Mom sat me down at her new smaller apartment and showed me the accounting she'd done with her financial advisor, and she said, After paying off the mortgage and closing costs, there's $200,000 left, and I'm splitting it between you and Marcus, but I'm using Marcus's portion to pay off the rest of his restitution debt to you, so you'll get your $100,000 and the remainder of what he owes, and he'll get nothing. And that feels right to me because he needs to understand that actions have consequences. I tried to argue that she didn't need to give me her portion, that the house sale money was hers, but she held up her hand and said, Emma, let me do this. Let me finally do something that shows you that I value you equally, that I see what I did wrong. And I accepted it with tears in my eyes, because it wasn't about the money, it was about her finally making a choice that put my needs on the same level as Marcus's. I used the inheritance money exactly as Dad had probably hoped I would, putting $60,000 down on a beautiful 2-bedroom condo in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city and Mount Rainier in the distance. And I invested another $40,000 in a diversified portfolio that my financial advisor helped me set up. And for the first time in my life, I felt financially secure in a way that had nothing to do with my salary and everything to do with having a foundation that couldn't be taken away. At work, I'd been functioning on a strange kind of focused energy since the trial, pouring myself into a major project analyzing fraud detection patterns in our client accounts. And my boss Jennifer called me into her office in early November and said, Emma, I'm promoting you to Director of Fraud Analytics, which comes with a salary of $180,000 plus bonus. And I want you to know that this isn't sympathy. This is because your work on the Henderson account saved us approximately $4 million in potential losses. And I sat in her office feeling something shift inside me because I'd spent so long believing that my achievements were invisible. But here was proof that competence gets recognized when you're in an environment that values it. I'd started hiking on weekends as a way to process everything that had happened, joining a group that met Saturday mornings at various trailheads around the Cascades, and that's where I met Alex Chen, a software engineer with an easy smile and a way of listening that felt genuine rather than performative. And after 3 weeks of hiking together, we went for coffee, and I found myself telling him the entire story about Marcus and the inheritance and the trial, and I watched his face carefully for signs of judgment or discomfort. But instead he said, "That must have taken incredible courage, standing up to your family like that. And I'm sorry you had to go through it, but I'm impressed by how you handled it." We started dating cautiously in that way people in their late 20s date, when they've been hurt before and are trying to be smart about protecting themselves. But Alex was patient with my boundaries and respectful of my need to take things slowly, and he never made me feel like I was asking for too much when I said I needed space to process things. And gradually, I realized I was building something with someone who saw my strength rather than trying to diminish it. On a cold Saturday in December, I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried and stood in front of his headstone with my coat pulled tight against the wind, and I told him about the condo and the promotion and about Alex. And I said out loud, "I finally understand what you wanted for me. You wanted me to know that I deserved security and respect and love that didn't require me to make myself smaller." And I stood there crying while the winter sun broke through the clouds, and I felt something like his presence, like approval, like the kind of love that empowers rather than controls. Marcus wrote me a letter from prison that arrived in mid-December, forwarded through Jessica Thornton because he didn't have my current address, and I sat at my kitchen table staring at the envelope for 20 minutes before I finally opened it, and his handwriting was the same as it had always been, that careless scrawl that suggested he'd never had to worry about being taken seriously. The letter was 3 pages long and started with, "Emma, I've had a lot of time to think about what I did." And it went on to describe prison life and therapy sessions the facility required, and how he was beginning to understand the impact of his actions. But even in his apology, there was a thread of self-pity, a sense that he was the real victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own consequences. And he wrote, "I hope someday you can forgive me because you're my sister and family should mean something." And I read that line several times and felt nothing but a kind of distant sadness. I didn't respond to the letter, and I didn't throw it away. I just filed it in the folder with all the legal documents from the case, and I told Dr. Mendez in our next session that I wasn't ready to forgive him, and I might never be ready. And she said, "That's okay. Forgiveness isn't something you owe anyone. It's something you choose if and when it serves your healing, and right now what you need is to keep building your new life." 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, I woke up on a Saturday morning in my Capitol Hill condo and realized with something like surprise that I felt happy. Not the complicated, tentative happiness that comes with waiting for the other shoe to drop, but a genuine, settled contentment that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep in my chest. And as I made coffee in my sun-filled kitchen and looked out at the Space Needle rising against a clear February sky, I thought about how completely my life had transformed since that restaurant confrontation that felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. My relationship with my mother had evolved into something I never thought possible, not the close mother-daughter bond you see in greeting card commercials, but something more honest and sustainable, built on clear boundaries and mutual respect rather than the old dynamic of her demanding accommodation and me providing it at the cost of my own dignity. She called me every Sunday now and actually asked about my work. And when I told her about the major presentation I'd given to our executive team about implementing AI-driven fraud detection, She listened to the whole story without once interrupting or changing the subject to Marcus, and she said, "That sounds incredibly complex. You must have worked so hard on that." And I'd had to pause because hearing genuine interest in my achievements from her felt like learning a new language after 30 years of speaking only one. The previous weekend, she'd driven up to Seattle, and I'd taken her to my favorite brunch place in Capitol Hill. And over Eggs Benedict, she told me about her own therapy sessions and how her therapist was helping her understand the roots of her favoritism, how she'd seen Marcus's neediness as love and my independence as rejection. And she said, "I punished you for being strong. I made you feel like your competence meant you didn't deserve tenderness." And we'd both gotten teary in the middle of the crowded restaurant, but I didn't care because this was real connection, messy and imperfect but finally honest. At work, I'd been thriving in my new director role with a team of 6 analysts reporting to me, and the fraud detection system I'd designed had saved our clients over $8 million in the first quarter alone, and my boss Jennifer had told me in my annual review that I was being considered for VP track, and I'd felt that same quiet pride that I was learning to recognize as healthy self-acknowledgement rather than the desperate need for external validation that had driven me for so long. I'd also started volunteering 3 evenings a month with a nonprofit called Financial Justice Coalition that helped victims of family financial abuse. And I'd told my story in a support group of 12 people who'd been stolen from or exploited by relatives. And afterward, a young woman named Teresa had hugged me and said, "Thank you for showing us that we're allowed to pursue justice even when people say we're destroying the family." And I realized that my experience with Marcus, as painful as it had given me a kind of purpose I'd never expected, a way to transform my worst betrayal into something that might help others find their own courage. The holiday gathering at Mom's apartment in December had been the first major family event without Marcus, who was still serving his sentence at the medium security facility in Spokane with 10 months remaining. And Uncle James and Aunt Carol had driven in from Portland, and we'd had a quiet dinner where Mom had raised her glass and said, "To Emma, my daughter, who I'm finally really seeing, who I'm finally really honoring, the way I should have all along." And I'd looked around that table at the small group of people who genuinely valued me, and felt something settle in my soul, a sense that I'd finally found my way to a family dynamic that didn't require me to diminish myself to fit. 1 year to the day after the restaurant confrontation that had changed everything, I sat at my desk in my corner office at the financial firm and realized that I'd become a completely different person. Not in the superficial ways that self-help books promise, but in the fundamental sense of knowing my own worth independent of anyone else's acknowledgement. And when my assistant brought in the notification that Marcus Castellano had been released from the medium security facility to a halfway house in Spokane and was officially beginning his 5-year probation period, I felt nothing but a distant kind of neutrality, like reading about someone I used to know, rather than my own brother. 2 days later, Jessica Thornton called to tell me that Marcus had submitted a formal request through his probation officer to meet with me, saying he wanted to apologize in person and begin the process of rebuilding our relationship. And I listened to her relay his message and felt absolutely certain in my answer when I said, "No, I'm not ready, and I may never be ready, and that's okay." And Jessica's response was immediate approval, saying, "You don't owe him your presence. You don't owe him your forgiveness. You only owe yourself whatever choice brings you peace." When I called my mother to tell her about Marcus's request and my refusal, she surprised me by saying, "Good, Emma, your peace matters more than his comfort, and I'm proud of you for knowing that." And I had to pause because hearing her prioritize my well-being over Marcus's feelings represented a transformation I'd never imagined possible. And I realized that her own therapy and her own reckoning with the damage her favoritism had caused had genuinely changed something fundamental in how she understood her role as a mother. I'd been doing a lot of reflecting on what the inheritance had really meant, and I'd come to understand that Dad's gift was never really about the $75,000, though that money had certainly changed my material circumstances. but rather, it was about giving me both permission and means to finally value myself the way he'd always valued me, to break free from the family dynamic that had kept me small and accommodating and perpetually seeking approval I would never receive. My life now looked nothing like it had a year ago, and as I walked through my Capitol Hill condo with its floor-to-ceiling windows and carefully chosen furniture and the sense of sanctuary that permeated every room, I felt the weight of genuine security, the knowledge that I'd built something that couldn't be taken from me because it existed both in external circumstances and internal conviction. At work, I was thriving in ways that still surprised me sometimes, leading a team of talented analysts and seeing my fraud detection systems save clients millions of dollars, and being respected not despite my strength, but because of it. And the VP promotion that Jennifer had mentioned was looking increasingly likely for the next fiscal year. Alex had proposed to me on a hiking trail overlooking Mount Rainier 3 weeks ago, getting down on one knee on a granite outcropping while the September sun turned the mountain gold. And when he'd said, "Emma, you are the strongest, most genuine person I've ever met, and I want to spend my life being someone who sees and honors that strength," I'd said yes while crying because he was choosing me for exactly who I was, rather than who I could make myself become. We were planning a small wedding for next summer with my mother involved in the planning in a way that felt collaborative rather than controlling, and she'd asked me about my preferences and listened to my answers and respected my choices. And even this small thing felt revolutionary given our history. On a gray October afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried, and I stood in front of his headstone with my left hand resting on the granite so the engagement ring was visible. And I told him about my promotion and about Alex and about the nonprofit work I was doing helping other people escape family financial abuse. And I said, "The inheritance you left me was never really about money, was it? It was about giving me permission to finally put myself first, to understand that I deserved security and respect and love that didn't require me to diminish myself. And thank you, Dad. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for loving me in a way that empowered rather than controlled." I stood there for a long time thinking about Marcus and whether he would ever truly change, whether prison and probation and losing everything would transform him into someone capable of genuine empathy and accountability. And I realized that I didn't know, and I might never know, because his transformation wasn't my responsibility, and his redemption wasn't required for my peace. What mattered was that I had changed, that I'd finally learned the difference between family loyalty and allowing abuse, that I'd chosen justice over comfort and self-preservation over obligatory tolerance. And in doing so, I'd freed myself from a prison I'd been living in for 30 years without even recognizing the bars. I don't know if Marcus will ever truly understand what he did or become someone capable of real relationship. But I did change. I transformed from someone who accepted crumbs and called it love into someone who knows her own worth and refuses to settle for less than genuine respect. And that was the point all along. That was what Dad had hoped for when he left me that inheritance and wrote in his will that it was specifically for me, because he knew that sometimes love means giving someone the tools to save themselves. As I walked away from his grave toward my car, the clouds broke and afternoon sunlight poured through, and I looked back once at the headstone and then turned forward toward the parking lot and the drive home and the life I'd built and the future I was choosing, and I felt something I'd never quite felt before, a sense of complete alignment between who I was and who I wanted to be, the knowledge that I'd finally become the person my father had always believed I could be, someone strong enough to demand justice and brave enough to build joy.